A cat asks the police for help. And when the police followed him and what they discovered, they were terrified. It was a cold autumn morning, and the streets were practically deserted, enveloped by a light mist that rose from the sidewalks still damp from the previous nights. Stillness. Everything was peaceful as usual, and the city seemed to be going about its usual routine, where nothing out of the ordinary rarely happened. Henry and Madison, two experienced police officers, started another day of work. The local police station, situated in a central area close to the main square, was a place where few significant events took place. Small conflicts between neighbors, occasional arguments, and sometimes a traffic accident were the most activity that could be seen there. Life seemed to follow a slow and predictable rhythm, and they were both used to this apparent monotony. While Henry was having a coffee in front of the police station, he observed the street with a distracted look, until something caught his attention. It was the cat. Not just any cat, but the same one that used to frequently appear there. His gray fur and deep, expressive eyes were unmistakable. He wasn't exactly a domestic animal, nor did he seem to have an owner, but his constant presence in the police station area made him almost a familiar figure. The feline had a peculiar behavior. He appeared and disappeared as if he were a ghost, walking without making a sound, always on the sidelines of what was happening, as if he knew more than he let on. But that morning something was different. Henry noticed that the cat was not simply wandering around as usual. Her movements had an intention, something that intrigued him deeply. "Madison, look at the cat again," he said, frowning, pointing in the direction of the slowly approaching animal. Madison, who was distracted fiddling with some papers inside the car, took a while to notice what Henry was trying to show. Madison barely looked up and replied absently. She must be looking for food as always to her. The cat's behavior was nothing more than usual, but Henry attentive noticed that something was different. The feline wasn't just passing by. As usual, he stopped halfway, faced the two police officers, and let out a loud, high-pitched meow. It wasn't just any sound. It was a meow full of urgency which echoed through the alley near the police station, almost like a cry for help. Intrigued, Henry crouched down, extending his hand towards the cat, trying to understand what he wanted. But contrary to expectations, the animal did not approach. Instead, he jumped back, keeping his eyes fixed on Henry and Madison, and let out another meow, even more insistent. It was as if he was trying to make a connection, as if he desperately needed to say something. Henry looked at Madison seriously and said, "That cat is not acting normally. See this? He's trying to show us something." His more serious tone caught Madison's attention, who finally looked away from the paper she was organizing. When he looked at the feline, he felt a pang of curiosity. The cat's eyes seemed fixed on theirs, intense and almost hypnotic. Madison hesitated for a moment, but something about the animal's behavior made her feel that there was something more going on there. The cat then took a few steps back, stopping in the middle of the street. He looked at the two again, as if he was calling them, as if he wanted to lead them somewhere. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Madison muttered, still trying to ignore the strangeness of the situation. However, an uneasy feeling began to rise within her, as if something bigger was about to reveal itself. Suddenly the cat turned and began to walk hurriedly down the street, stopping from time to time to look back and check. If the two police officers were following him, Henry didn't think twice. He got up quickly and, without waiting for Madison, said, "Let's follow him." Madison looked at the papers that were on the car seat, wondering if she should really waste time on this. Henry's determined expression made it clear that he had already made his decision, and something inside Madison, perhaps a police instinct or something deeper, impelled her to follow him. "Well, if this is just a waste of time, you owe me a coffee," she said, trying to break the tension hanging in the air with a tone of lightness. The two began to follow the cat as it advanced through the deserted streets with intriguing confidence. The city seemed unusually silent that morning. Only the sound of Henry and Madison's footsteps and the feline's occasional meow broke the atmosphere. As they walked, the mood began to change in almost imperceptible but undeniably unsettling ways. The dark clouds that had previously been far away on the horizon now seemed to gather above them, filling the air with a feeling of heaviness and discomfort. The cat guided them with precision, entering narrow alleys and crossing almost invisible passages, places that would go unnoticed by most. The streetlights flickered, creating an effect that amplified the unease and the feeling that something was out of place. "That doesn't smell good to me," Madison muttered, looking around with a mix of apprehension and suspicion. Henry, however, seemed focused only on the animal, as if he knew it was leading them to something important. As they advanced, they began to realize that they were leaving the busiest areas of the city behind. The scenery was now made up of isolated, aged streets, where abandoned warehouses lined up in silence, forgotten places that no one would have reason to visit. The cat stopped in front of one of the oldest warehouses in the region. It was a building forgotten by time, with thick rusty chains and a padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. All around, tall grass and broken windows reinforced the abandonment of the place. However, the cat didn't seem to mind. It stood in front of the door, letting out an even louder and more distressing meow, as if it was begging for attention. "Why did it bring us here?" Madison asked, feeling her heart race in her chest. Henry, with a serious face, took a step forward, approaching the door. Something was definitely wrong. The silence around them was almost suffocating, as if the world had stopped. Even the wind, which had previously blown steadily, was now still. The cat remained fixed, staring at the door as if it wasn't going to leave until they did something. "I think we need to go in," Henry said, trying to hide the nervousness beginning to appear in his voice. Madison looked around, feeling the weight of the environment. It was as if the air around them was charged, as if something invisible was watching them. As she approached the door, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. Although the padlock was rusty, the chain was loose, as if it had been disturbed recently. "It wasn't like this before," she commented, casting an apprehensive look at Henry. He nodded and cautiously stepped forward. Madison lifted the chain and slowly pulled the door. The creak echoed in the silence like a scream, as if the door hadn't been opened in decades. As soon as the passage revealed itself, a strong and unpleasant smell filled the air, making the two hesitate for a moment. Madison brought her hand to her face, trying to block out the odor and ignore the growing uneasiness that seemed to tighten her stomach. Before they could react, the cat entered first, its movements determined almost as if he knew exactly where he was going. Henry and Madison exchanged a brief look, and then without words decided to follow the animal inside. The mystery only seemed to deepen as they stepped into the warehouse. Henry and Madison illuminated the dark interior with their flashlights, revealing a space heavy with gloom. Old boxes and remnants of furniture were scattered across the floor, all covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. With each step they took, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. Then the silence was broken. A strange sound echoed from the back of the warehouse. Something was moving. Henry glanced at Madison, his heart racing. "Whatever it is, we're about to find out," he murmured. The tension in the air was palpable. The cat continued moving forward, its determination unwavering. "What do you think this is?" Madison whispered, struggling to control her breathing. Her senses were on high alert, each sound and movement fueling her unease. "I don't know," Henry replied, his eyes fixed on the dark depths of the warehouse, "but we'd better stay alert." The cat suddenly stopped and turned to face them, its piercing eyes ensuring they wouldn't waver. It let out a long, tense meow before turning back and heading toward a shadowy corner. Once again, silence consumed the space, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. As they moved deeper, the strangeness of the place became even more apparent. Broken boxes, marks on the floor, and a nauseating stench hinted that someone or something had been there recently. Madison directed her flashlight toward one of the partially opened boxes in the corner. The lid was broken, as though it had been hurriedly overturned. Her hand trembled as she opened the box completely. What she found inside made her catch her breath. Children's clothes. They weren't old or tattered, but clean, as though recently abandoned. Tiny coats, shoes, and other items lay carelessly tossed inside. "What is this?" Madison whispered, holding a small coat in her hands, her voice shaking with disbelief. Henry stepped closer, squinting at the contents, trying to make sense of it all. The cat, now sitting motionless, stared intently at something beyond them, its rigid posture hinting that the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, the eerie silence was shattered by a louder noise. It came from deeper inside the warehouse, beyond a partially open metal door. Henry instinctively aimed his flashlight toward it, revealing an even darker space beyond. Tension surged as the two officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they were on the cusp of something far more sinister than they had imagined. "My God," Madison muttered, her voice barely audible. The metallic door creaked as they pushed it open, and an unbearable stench hit them like a wall. Inside, they found a man's body, lifeless, and seemingly abandoned for days, maybe weeks. Yet, something about the scene didn't add up. The man wasn't dressed like someone homeless or vulnerable. He wore decent clothes, and in his hand he clutched a golden pendant shaped like a cross. Henry leaned in to examine it, carefully pulling the chain free to hold it up in the light. The simple but significant design suggested the pendant held personal meaning. Who could he be? And what was he doing here? Henry muttered, more to himself than to Madison. The cat sat beside the body, its watchful eyes scanning the scene as though guarding it. Its eerie stillness only added to the oppressive atmosphere. "Whatever this is," Madison said, her voice unsteady, "it's not normal. This place is—" She trailed off as a new sound pierced the silence, rapid, heavy footsteps approaching from outside. "We need to get out of here," Henry said urgently, grabbing Madison's arm. They switched off their flashlights and began moving toward the exit as quietly as possible, but the cat didn't follow. It stayed beside the body as though its purpose wasn't yet fulfilled. Henry cast one last glance at the feline, its silhouette stark against the darkness. Something in the animal's behavior conveyed an unsettling certainty. Meanwhile, the footsteps grew louder, echoing through the warehouse walls. Hiding behind a stack of boxes, Henry and Madison held their breath. The heavy steps finally revealed their source, a tall man dressed in dark clothes. He carried something in his hands, though the dim light obscured it. Madison's heart pounded as she gripped Henry's arm tightly. "We need to get out now," she whispered, her voice laced with urgency. Henry nodded, and they carefully moved toward the side door. Just as they were steps away from freedom, a sound behind them froze. The cat let out a loud meow, which echoed throughout the space like an inevitable alarm. The man immediately turned towards the sound. His eyes roamed the warehouse until they fixed on the cat, which remained standing next to the body. He hesitated for a moment, visibly confused, but then reached into his coat and pulled out something Henry and Madison no longer had a choice. It was now or never. They ran out the door, the man's footsteps sounding behind them, getting closer and closer as they fled. The cat remained where it was next to the body, its eyes glowing in the dark, as if it were waiting for the next act of a drama that had not yet ended. The chase began with a frenzy. The night was dense and freezing. The wind cut into Henry and Madison's faces as they ran through the warehouse courtyard. The surrounding trees cast shadows that partially obscured them, but the footsteps of the men behind them grew louder and closer. Madison felt her heart beating so hard that it felt like it was about to explode. Each breath was an effort to maintain the frantic pace of her flight. The mystery that had begun quietly inside the warehouse had turned into a desperate race for survival, and the danger seemed to only be beginning. Madison knew that Henry was as scared as she was, but there was no time for hesitation. "Don't stop," shouted Henry. Grabbing her arm to keep her moving, the two ran along the side of the warehouse, avoiding the precarious lights from the street lights scattered across the abandoned lot. The warehouse was just one of several industrial buildings forgotten in time, and the silence around was only broken by the sounds of their desperate escape and the footsteps of the armed man who followed closely behind them. They knew they had little time. The man had seen something he didn't want anyone else to know. And now Henry and Madison were in the middle of something much bigger than a simple investigation. Henry pulled Madison behind an old pile of rusty boxes, pressing his finger against her lips so that she silenced even her panting. The mysterious man entered the courtyard, his steps slowing down each movement, more careful, as if he was meticulously analyzing every corner, every sound. He walked with his gun in hand, prepared for anything. Madison felt sweat running down her temples, mixing with the biting cold of the night. Her hands shook and fear began to paralyze her, turning her into a statue. His eyes turned to Henry, who remained focused, trying to calculate his next step, watching for any opening to escape. Then unexpectedly something caught the man's attention. A sound from inside the warehouse echoed across the courtyard. Madison squeezed Henry's arm and whispered, almost in disbelief. The cat, the feline's long, high-pitched meow, resounded through the walls, cutting through the silence like a blade, and diverting the pursuer's focus for a moment. The man turned toward the warehouse entrance, hesitating. His gaze flickered between the dark interior and the space around it. Henry and Madison, hidden, held their breath. They felt a momentary relief, but knew the cat-and-mouse game was far from over. "If he continues the search outside, he's giving us a chance," Henry murmured, his eyes fixed on the man. The man looked back one last time before disappearing into the dark warehouse. Henry and Madison watched in silence as he walked away, every second stretching into an eternity. When they finally lost sight of him, Madison whispered, her voice thick with urgency, "We need to get out of here and call for backup. This man is involved in something very serious." "I agree," replied Henry, already standing but still watching the entrance. "But first, we need to find out what it is. We can't leave here without concrete evidence." Madison hesitated, torn between caution and the need to act. She knew Henry was right. Running away now, without understanding what was really happening, could mean missing the chance to uncover something much bigger. The cat had led them to this place for a reason, and abandoning everything at that moment felt wrong. There was more to be discovered, something they couldn't yet grasp. With no time to waste, the two moved silently, searching for a discreet way to re-enter the warehouse, away from the man's line of sight. Their hearts raced, but a new feeling emerged: determination. After a few minutes, they found a small, partially broken window on the opposite side of the building. It was narrow, but big enough for both of them to squeeze through. Henry looked at Madison, and she nodded in agreement. Carefully, they climbed through the opening and landed in a damp, cramped room. The air was thick with a musty stench, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. Henry turned on his flashlight, illuminating the room. "We have to be quick," he whispered firmly. "We don't know how long we have until he comes back." The room appeared to be an old storage area, cluttered with rusty shelves and abandoned tools. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and the smell of decay lingered. "We need to find something that tells us who this man is and what he's doing here," Madison said, as she began searching. Her eyes soon fell on a small iron cabinet in the corner. Something about it seemed different, almost out of place. "Maybe this will tell us something," she said, picking up an iron bar to pry open the rusty lock. After a few tense moments and loud clicks, the cabinet creaked open. Inside, they found old folders, each marked with a name and a date. Henry grabbed one and quickly flipped through it, his eyes widening as he absorbed its contents. Madison opened another and gasped. The folders contained detailed reports of missing children, photographs, dates, descriptions, everything meticulously documented. "These children have been missing for months," Madison said, her voice trembling. No one knew what happened to them. This is horrifying. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to process the enormity of their discovery. Henry held another folder tightly, his face grim. "This man," he said slowly, "is involved in something much bigger than we imagined." The weight of their discovery pressed down on them, making the air feel suffocating. Time was against them, and they both knew their next move would be crucial. The mystery wasn't just about the man or the cat anymore. It was about something far darker. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. The man was returning. "We need to get out of here now," Madison whispered, quickly closing the folder she was holding. But before they could move, something unexpected happened. The cat reappeared, emerging from a shadowy corner of the room. Its luminous eyes were fixed on them, and it let out a soft meow. This time, the sound wasn't urgent but almost reassuring, like a final gesture of guidance. Henry and Madison exchanged a look, understanding the silent message. It was time to leave. With renewed urgency, they prepared to exit the room. The man hadn't noticed them yet, but they knew every second counted. Just as they reached the door and carefully opened it, the sound of scraping metal echoed loudly through the warehouse. The man, alerted, turned toward the noise, raising his gun. "Run!" Henry shouted, grabbing Madison's hand. They bolted out of the warehouse, plunging into the night as gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets whizzed past, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Every step was a race against death, but an unshakable feeling grew within them. The worst was yet to come. As they ran, clutching the folders, Madison glanced at the documents. "These reports," she said, breathless, "are just the start. That man is involved, but who else?" Henry's jaw tightened. "We can't go back there now. It's too dangerous," he said. "We need reinforcements and a plan. But first, we need to expose this." Madison nodded, her mind racing. The cat's behavior lingered in her thoughts. It had guided them every step of the way, almost as if it understood their mission. She opened one folder and froze. A photograph of a young girl stared back at her. Beneath the picture was a name: Isabella. Madison's voice broke as she whispered, "She disappeared 3 months ago." No one listened to her parents. No one did anything. The weight of the family's suffering hit her hard. This wasn't just about the man or the warehouse. It was about an entire system that had turned a blind eye. Somehow, the responsibility of uncovering the truth had fallen to them. "We need to be smart," Henry said, breaking the silence. "Let's go to the local newspaper. They can help us spread the word safely without alerting those involved." Madison hesitated, knowing the risk of going public, but after a moment she nodded. "You're right. We have to act fast." They began their cautious journey toward the city, every step fraught with tension. The darkness around them seemed alive, hiding unseen dangers. Yet their determination burned brighter. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for justice, for the children, their families, and everyone who had suffered because of this dark conspiracy. After hours of careful travel, they finally reached the city center. The streetlights cast long shadows over the deserted streets, creating an eerie atmosphere. "The newspaper is across the avenue," Henry said, pointing to a building with bright windows. They exchanged a look, knowing the next step was critical. As they crossed the avenue, an unsettling feeling crept over them. Were they being watched? The shadows seemed heavier, the silence oppressive. Quickening their pace, they entered the newspaper building, where a surprised security guard greeted them. "What are you doing here at this hour?" the guard asked, suspicion in his voice. Still panting, Henry replied with urgency, "We need to talk to the editor. It's an emergency." The guard frowned, hesitating for a moment, but something in Henry's serious expression convinced him. He nodded and let them pass. Shortly afterward, the two were sitting face to face with the newspaper editor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an expression that mixed curiosity and skepticism. "What exactly do you have that can't wait until tomorrow?" he asked, beginning to leaf through the folders Madison had placed on the table. "This can't wait," Madison replied, her voice trembling as she struggled to control her emotions. Children are disappearing, and we have concrete evidence that there's a network behind it. We found this evidence, and we almost got killed trying to escape with it." Her eyes were fixed on the editor, who was now beginning to show genuine interest. He analyzed the documents carefully, flipping through page after page. His expression slowly changed. Seriousness replaced skepticism, and clear concern took over his face. What lay before him was no ordinary denunciation. It wasn't a vague suspicion. It was something much bigger, much darker, and much more dangerous. He knew that publishing it would not only put the newspaper at the center of a maelstrom, but also expose everyone involved to incalculable risk. The unspoken question lingered in the air. Could they afford to ignore it? "This is very serious," said the editor finally, placing the papers back on the table. His expression was somber, and his voice carried the weight of the moment. "If what you're saying is true, it will dominate the news, but it could also put our lives at risk." Henry and Madison exchanged looks, aware of the danger they faced. "We know," Henry replied, his voice firm, "but we need to do what's right." The editor took a deep breath, visibly thoughtful. "I'll help you," he said after a pause, "but we need to be extremely careful. I'm going to contact some trusted people and start investigating this discreetly. If we're dealing with a network, we can't act impulsively, otherwise they'll destroy all the evidence." As the editor began devising a plan for the next stage of the investigation, Madison looked out the window. Outside, on the dark sidewalk, was the cat. Its eyes shone in the moonlight, fixed as if watching every movement. For a moment, Madison smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and hope. "We're on the right track," she said softly. Henry, at her side, nodded in agreement. "I feel that way too," he replied. They both knew, however, that the next few hours would be crucial. The enemy was closer than they could imagine, and somehow the cat seemed to be more involved than they could understand. The silence of the night seemed even thicker as Madison and Henry left the newspaper office. Each step was accompanied by a growing sense of vigilance. They knew they had put their lives on the line by seeking the editor's help, but they also knew there was no turning back. Time was against them, and the disappearance ring seemed to be closing in not only on being unmasked, but also on finding them. The cat was still there, sitting on the sidewalk, its bright eyes fixed on Henry and Madison's every move. Henry crouched down and gently ran his hand over the animal's head. For the first time that night, he felt true gratitude for the little feline. The cat's presence seemed to be more than a coincidence. It was as if something greater, something inexplicable, was guiding them, urging them to continue. "We need to get back to the warehouse," Madison said, breaking the silence with renewed determination. "There are still more answers there, and something tells me that what we found was just the tip of the iceberg." Henry looked at her, hesitant. He knew that returning would be extremely dangerous, but at the same time he was certain that the truth they sought was there, waiting to be discovered. "Okay," he agreed, "but we need to be even more careful this time. We can't afford to get caught again." With that, the two started their way back to the abandoned warehouse. The night air was thick and heavy, and each step seemed to bring with it a new sense of imminent danger. The cat followed them, its silent paws gliding over the ground like a protective ghost. Its constant presence, as enigmatic as it was, served as a reminder that they were not alone, even if danger surrounded them.